Hey, it's Jordan with Status Coup. Delighted as always to be joined by Kshama Sawant, soon to be former Seattle council member, which we'll talk about, and has created Workers Strike Back, which I think is badly needed. We could definitely get into, and plenty to talk about in terms of national politics. But I want to start in Seattle because before you leave, you've decided to, on your own accord, leave your role at the end of the year and be a full-time organizer. You're really pushing the fight for rent control in Seattle, which many cities need it, but Seattle you could put at the top of the list. I remember when I was there a few years ago, I think rent had gone up like 70% or something over the 5 years. And clearly, the Democratic establishment there in Seattle is not really joining the fight with you. Can you talk about, you've held some events in the community recently, and you are really pushing for this. What specifically type of caps are you proposing on rent increases? And what's the likelihood of maybe this succeeding in Seattle?
Yes, first of all, thank you so much, Jordan, for having me. And yes, you're right. The skyrocketing rent crisis and a housing unaffordability crisis in Seattle is more acute than ever, more even than when you and I met for an in-person interview here in Seattle a few years ago. And the most explosive statistic I can share with you, and there's many statistics, but the most poignant one is the one that shows that between 2010 and 2020, Seattle rents went up nearly 92%, which means nearly doubling. I mean, that is just astounding. And I can't even imagine in reality what that must look like in numbers. And so that's how much the rent has skyrocketed in Seattle. And what we're proposing is a rent control measure that covers all rental homes in the citywide rent control, no exception, regardless of type, size, or building date of the rental home. And that means that there will be no corporate loopholes if we have anything to do with it. Obviously, the big piece here is what you mentioned, which is the Democrats' betrayal so far. And even now, the fact that they have not said a single word about this rent control legislation. But that's the kind of rent control legislation we're proposing. And when I say we, I mean my office, Socialist Alternative, my organization, Workers Strike Back, the national movement we've launched, and the vast majority of renters who agree with us. Already we know that over 35,000 Seattle renters and homeowners, and even some small landlords actually who support us, have signed public petitions in support of such a strong rent control bill as I have described. And then furthermore, there's a statewide poll. Washington State likely voters in 2020, 71% of them said that they support strong rent control measures. So this is a very popular idea with good reason, because people don't need PhDs in economics to understand that when they make their meager incomes, working people in Seattle, most of their meager incomes goes to corporate landlords. And it's not because these landlords need all this money. In reality, we have seen that the rent skyrocketing is directly proportional to the profit skyrocketing for corporate landlords, the real estate barons, the property management corporations, and really, let's be clear, it's the major shareholders, the big banks of Wall Street, the venture capitalists. All of these guys are involved. And as if the normal, quote unquote, normal state of capitalism where renters get gouged year after year and the profits of these real estate magnates keep expanding was not bad enough. Now we know of this scandal where there's alleged price fixing happening. The most of the corporate landlords are engaged in price fixing as alleged by 3 separate lawsuits, and many of Seattle's biggest corporate landlords are complicit in this, and they've been named in the lawsuits. And so it's no surprise that rents are doubling for a lot of people, because it's literally, they're using this, as ProPublica's investigation revealed, they're literally using this AI-based algorithm that has been developed by RealPage Corporation, which, as RealPage executives themselves said, it actually cuts out the real-life whatever the property manager who may have some empathy. Literally, they said, you know, they may have some empathy with their tenants, and so let's cut out the empathy entirely and let's make this such a brazenly profit-driven initiative where renters get gouged year after year. That's why we need rent control urgently.
And perhaps not surprisingly, the landlords are not attending your meetings. And from what I read, they claim that this would actually attack the small landlords and force them to sell to Wall Street and other, you know, private equity vultures that are buying up all of America and then jacking up the prices. What do you say to that? Because it seems like they're trying to spin it that this would actually be a catastrophe for the small, you know, mom and pop type of landlord.
Yeah, as you said correctly, Jordan, only 2 or 3 of these naysaying landlords showed up at the public hearing that I hosted as a renters' rights committee, which I chair last week. And I'm sure you must have seen and hope your audience can also see how it was a jam-packed church hall where 150 renters were there, all of them saying we urgently need rent control without any corporate loopholes. And as I said, actually, there were other landlords and homeowners as well, but they were all supporting the rent control measure because they were talking about how Seattle has become this deeply unaffordable city and that working people, even union members, I mean, I can't tell you how many union members have spoken up saying that even with a union-based salary, which is slightly higher than non-union workers, even they can't afford this housing. And for landlords who say that it's about mom and pop landlords, I mean, let's be clear, this is rank fear mongering. If you are a genuinely mom and pop landlord who are not exploiting your tenant, then this rent control legislation will not affect you in any way, because this rent control legislation is saying that all rent increases are limited to no more than the inflation rate. So if you're not charging more than the inflation rate, then this legislation does not affect you in any way because you're already complying with our idea of rent control. This is meant for landlords who gouge. And I want to be honest, to be clear, I don't care if you're a small or big landlord. You don't have a right to exploit your tenant. So if you're charging more than the rate of inflation, then yes, this rent control legislation should apply to you regardless of your size. But having said that, if you look at the statistics, in fact, this is nationally developed statistics, the fact is that it is the corporate landlords who are much more likely to gouge their tenants than small landlords are. And I wanted to quote Erin Anderson, a worker and student who spoke at the hearing, who said, "I'm a mom and pop renter." So their point was that you all talk about mom and pop landlords as if it's their God-given right to exploit tenants. What about the mom and pop tenants? And the fact is, the vast majority of Seattle's renters are what we would call mom and pop tenants. In other words, that's just a figurative way of describing working families who are struggling to put food on the table. We had a mom of 2 children, Kaylin Nicholson, who was on my panel at the public hearing, who said that it is so hard to raise children in Seattle because over half of your income, for most working families, this is true, is going just to pay your rent. And where is this rent going? It is padding the insatiable greed of these big landlords.
And also, if you look at the big picture, Biden, the Federal Reserve right now are crowing about, according to them, inflation is back to 3%. And, the Federal Reserve's policies of jacking up interest rates are working. Well, you never hear about any efforts to lower the worst inflation that has been going on now for 20 years, which is the rise in rent and housing prices. That's just kind of acceptable, apparently, to the Washington, D.C. elites. And of course, on the local level, this rise in rents, there is no appetite among federal government, I think, on the city or state level to do anything to curb real estate developers, because the real estate developers are purchasing them, which obviously about in Seattle. Can you kind of talk about, other than you, there is no real policy proposals from Democrats, Republicans to do anything, rent control, obviously exploitation of tenants, because that is one of the biggest special interests out there purchasing city governments.
That's very true. Any kind of substantive progressive policy to alleviate this searing housing unaffordability crisis is completely absent from the Democratic Party, whether you talk about the city level, Washington state, other states, and also, not to mention the congressional and Biden level. We just saw in the midst of this pandemic and the unprecedented cost of living crisis and sky high rents, we saw the Minneapolis, St. Paul, the Twin Cities in Minnesota, the Democrats there repeal rent control measures. I mean, really shameful in the middle of this unseen, thus far unseen crisis. This is what the Democrats are doing. And I want to come to the Democrats in Seattle and Washington State, but very quickly I wanted to say, the point you were making about how actually the cost of living crisis is not some act of God. It is a product of the way capitalism functions, and especially in this new period of massive global crisis. And in fact, one of the terms that has been evolved based on working people's correct understanding that these high prices, not just for housing, but for food and other necessities as well, is not automatic. It is precisely driven by two things. One is the greed of the very wealthy under capitalism, the capitalist class, but also their ability to do it. Because they have the wealth, they also have the political power and the clout to make this happen. And ultimately, it's a recognition of the balance of power. As long as the wealthy classes have the balance of power, they're going to keep exploiting us. And so an understanding of all of this has actually started to emerge among the U.S. working class, and the term that has been coined is greedflation. Greedflation is a term that is sort of an acknowledgement of the fact that, well, yes, it's inflation, but it's not automatic. It's a product of the greed of these rich people who will keep taking away from us, and that's why you see these unprecedented levels of inequality. And so, yeah, in the context of all of this, U.S. Congress and the Democrats in U.S. Congress and the Biden regime, they have completely failed to address this crisis, housing unaffordability crisis. In Washington state, there has been a ban. In 1981, there was a ban instituted on statewide ban on any municipalities carrying out rent control. So can you imagine? This ban has been in place for 42 years, which is a longer time span than many people who are fighting today for rent control have been alive. Many of the people who need rent control the most are younger people, young families with little children, people, students, young workers at Starbucks and Amazon warehouses and many other places. And they haven't even been alive for 42 years. That's how long the Democrats have allowed the ban to exist in the state of Washington. And what's important to mention for your nationwide audience is that in the state of Washington, the Democrats have held the governor's mansion, the state house, and the state senate for many decades together. I mean, it's not like they've had it all the time in those 42 years, but there have been many periods of years and decades at a stretch where they've held the power, but they have failed. In fact, refused, is the right thing to say, refused to lift the state ban. And in the same token, in the same tone, the Seattle City Democrats have also refused to do anything about the skyrocketing rents. Just to give you a concrete example, the state legislature this session, they have the majority in both state houses, significant majorities. The governor is a Democrat. There were two bills to lift this unjust statewide ban. Not one of those bills got even a committee discussion, let alone a vote. This is what the Democrats are doing. I mean, they are just blatant in making it clear they stand with corporate greed and with corporate landlords and the real estate barons, not with the working people statewide who are struggling. And then the city level Democrats, our legislation has been public news for weeks. In fact, to be honest with you, it's for years, because we developed this legislation in 2019 and it's been available for anyone to see. But not one of the 8 Democrats on the city council to date has said, I support this bill, I stand with working people and renters, I'm going to vote yes on this bill without any corporate loopholes. Yesterday, the Seattle Times had an article out, not one Democrat willing to say they support this.
Of course. And that was my last question on this point. What do you think their strategy is? Run out the clock? You're not that you won't be active, but you won't be a city council member anymore in the new year. Just run out the clock, kind of virtue signal that they agree on doing something, but obviously not agree with your proposal? And what's the odds of actually getting something substantial done? Obviously, people said, didn't believe you could pull off, you and your obviously socialist alternative could pull off $15 minimum wage and many of your other victories. What's the odds of getting something done before you leave?
Jordan, it's going to be all of that. It's going to be virtue signaling. It's going to be running out the clock. We know that they are obviously hoping that now that we are not running for office again, that the socialists will be out, and they absolutely will, in record time, they will attempt to take City Hall back to what they consider business as usual, which is corporate politicians running boring meetings that nobody wants to watch. The public is disengaged. Working people don't even know who their council members are, because why would they care? None of them stand up for them. There's nothing to come to City Hall for, nothing to agitate around, because there's no movement. This is what the Democratic establishment is hoping for. Whether that comes to, whether that's what happens or not, it really depends, again, as I said, on the balance of power, and that really a big part of that equation is social movements. Will we have social movements or not? And then the second part of that question is, will there be genuine, accountable leadership to those social movements? Just having movements is not going to be good enough, although that's the first step. We saw from BLM and other examples that, and also the anger against the repeal of Roe v. Wade by the reactionary Supreme Court. People are angry about a lot of things, about racial injustice, about attacks on abortion rights, about the cost of living crisis, the fact that most people don't have health care, the fact that the federal government did not even do a $15 minimum wage. There is tremendous anger on all of these issues. And there have been movements as well. But what we've also seen is that the NGO leaders, many of the labor leaders, unfortunately, and the Democrats certainly, they all have betrayed these social movements. They all have sort of given each other cover, and that's what we're going to see on this issue as well, for the most part. And one of the things that Democrats on the city council have done, as I said, there's 8 Democrats, there's me, 1 socialist. So often what they'll do is what I would call a bait and switch, where the Democrats who rely on having a progressive reputation for their political careers and their resume, they might vote yes, and the Democratic Party, it might be a decision jointly by the Democratic Party leadership but the rest of you guys vote no, and that way we'll have the progressives protecting themselves because they're running for re-election this year, and then the rest of you can make sure that the bill doesn't succeed, so it gets 4 votes in favor and 5 votes against. This is what I'm sure that they're planning, the best that they would be willing to do, which is, as I said, virtue signaling combined with bait and switch. However, what actually happens, again, is not a given. That is why my office and Workers Strike Back and the renters' rights movement, into the most active renters activists, we are continuing to fight, because we have seen over and over again that when we fight, we can win. One thing is guaranteed: if we don't fight, we're not going to win. That much is clear, because there's not going to be any pressure on the Democrats. At least, so as you said, we won the $15 an hour minimum wage. We won the Amazon tax, and we actually won a whole series of renters' rights through the fact that we have been building fighting struggles. And I just wanted to give you one concrete example quickly. Just weeks ago, my office pushed for, and we won, renters won, historic legislation. It's not on the scale of rent control, but nonetheless, it's extremely important, which is it limits all late fees, junk fees, all the assorted fees, quote unquote fees that corporate landlords charge. It limits all of those fees to no more than $10 a month. I mean, this is a huge achievement, but we were able to win only because renters came out and fought back and exposed the Democrats. And specifically what I want to mention is there is one self-described labor Democrat named Andrew Lewis, Councilmember Lewis. He's in the Renters' Rights Committee. He voted to water it down, and he sided with the rightmost Democrat on the council, and he voted to water it down in committee. The heat he got from renters and my office, it forced him to change his vote. So such things can happen also. We can force Democrats to support rent control, but as you said, they don't actually support it, but forced to vote yes, that can happen. Whether it will happen or not, again, as I said, will depend on how strongly we're able to build the movement. But of course, it's not going to be the end of the day. Regardless of the outcome, we are going to continue fighting.
And this is the first time I've interviewed you since you launched Workers Strike Back. You know, I've been covering elections and organizing for many years. And one issue I've always had is most of these progressive organizations who, you know, to be fair, are underfunded. Most of the organizing centers around elections. Sure, there's been some organizations that have popped up more focusing on rent, you know, tenants unions and mutual aid, but you know, the Our Revolutions and other groups were really centered around organizing around elections. It seems to me you're trying to shift the paradigm with Workers Strike Back to focus organizing 24/7 and not specifically around elections. Can you talk about why you and your group launched this and kind of the dynamic and the thinking behind it?
Yes, you know, as you were alluding to earlier, we have won 4 elections in Seattle to date, and we are going to be leaving office undefeated. And the reason we're not running again and instead we launched Workers Strike Back nationally is because the lessons that we have learned in Seattle, they are so, I mean, it shows you that this type of fighting strategy works, where you have democratically organized movements led by socialists, by Marxists, by the fighting left, where we have an accountable leadership in those movements and we have a strategy to win. This works. We need this strategy to be shared much more widely nationally, especially in the labor movement. And in fact, we didn't invent any of these ideas. We have seen many of these ideas come to fruition in the proud tradition of the American labor movement, going back to the 1930s when the successful general strikes were held, which was what the revolutionary fervor and the victories that were won at that time, which was what forced FDR to pass the New Deal. It was not from his beneficence, because, as he himself admitted, you know, it was a concession that was forced by the revolutionary struggles led by the militant labor activists at that time. So we need really, the labor movement needs a revival of those ideas, and we want Workers Strike Back as a nationwide movement to play a lead role alongside workers. You know, so for example, concretely, one of the things that Workers Strike Back activists are doing is showing their solidarity for the UPS Teamsters, which I hope we're able to talk about more. Also, the KCVG union drive for Amazon Air Hub, you know, in northern Kentucky. And so we need these ideas to be shared and acted upon on a larger scale than Seattle. That was the reason that we're not running again, and we've launched Workers Strike Back. And Workers Strike Back stands for $25 an hour minimum wage. Of course, some workers are actually fighting for a $30 an hour minimum wage, like Amazon workers, which we strongly support. We also need Medicare for all. We need union jobs for all. We also need to continue and really win victories in the fight against discrimination and oppression. And Workers Strike Back, last but not least, is also calling for a new party for the working class, which gets to your other point, which is that you have had Democrats betray working people over and over again. And obviously, Republican and the Trump right populist agenda is blatantly anti-worker and anti-people of color, and it's really deeply hostile to any decent idea of a decent society. And so we have to fight. But what has come out of these sort of for example, Bernie Sanders runs is not being in any way what working people need. You know, so on the one hand, as you've correctly said yourself, Jordan, many times, Bernie Sanders would have won. If Bernie Sanders had been the candidate against Trump, statistics show he would have won. That's how popular the idea of fighting against Wall Street, ending student debt, taxing the wealthy, Medicare for all, making life affordable for the working class, the tens of millions of Americans who are suffering, is so popular. That kind of agenda can unite people who are on the left and also working people who might otherwise end up voting for Trump. And but that's precisely the agenda that the Democratic Party is very hostile to. So what we need out of these kinds of election campaigns is a political organizing tool that can last beyond elections and really immerse itself in actual social struggle. That is the agenda of Workers Strike Back. And this is what we were calling on Bernie Sanders to do. You know, I personally and Socialist Alternative together He called on Bernie Sanders to launch a new party for working people coming out of his election campaigns, but that didn't happen. And that's what I'm hoping comes out of Cornel West's run for president, because we know it's not going to happen through one election cycle. It has to have a real organizing strategy on the ground in order to build this kind of militant mass movement.
And is one of the tools in the toolbox as workers' strike back grows, is one of them economic organizing. And what I mean by that, I've covered all the protests, Black Lives Matter, climate change, healthcare, you name it. And although I respect the organizations, at a certain point, you're just circling the same blocks, chanting the same things, but there's no economic threat added to it. The movements that seem to be winning in recent years are the strikes, John Deere, obviously Nabisco, Frito-Lay, obviously the Amazon labor union, Starbucks, when there's actually an economic component that could hurt the plutocrats. I would argue UPS would be massive. It seems that we're headed towards a possible historic strike because it will actually affect the broader economy. And suburban moms might be made inconvenienced if UPS is shut down for a little bit. Obviously, that's easier said than done, organizing economic boycotts, because we're not France. In France, they have healthcare, they have strong labor unions, so it's psychologically it's easier to go on strike, because let's say it's harder to lose your job over economic boycotts there. And if you do, you have healthcare and et cetera. But what is your views on adding those economic boycotts? I'm not saying we would have a general strike overnight, but you got to crawl before you could walk.
I think that's a very important point you're making. And in fact, what history shows is that the fight against specific types of discrimination and oppression are very much tied to economic demands as well in the first place, because the analysis of capitalism shows that in reality, the economic exploitation that working people face stems from the same systemic reasons that also makes it more convenient for the capitalist class to have a divide and conquer strategy. It's like Malcolm X said, you can't have capitalism without racism. And the point being that actually the different types of oppression, which are real, we would never say that they don't exist. They do happen, but the reason they happen is because it benefits the capitalist system for working people, the masses, to be divided. And so unless we have this very, very basic analysis right, it's not possible to win on either, on whether it's economic demands or demands that are related to racial or gender oppression. And the other thing that history shows is that it's when the fight on some issues of oppression, whether it's racism or against, for example, the denial of abortion rights, it's when those fights are tied to other movements that genuinely make a threat to the profit machine of the ruling class, as you were saying. That's when we are able to win. And in fact, the problem with the BLM movement was not that people weren't weren't hungry to win on issues of oppression. Obviously, over 20 million Americans, walked out on the streets in multiracial working class solidarity. But the reason that the BLM movement doesn't have anything commensurate to show in terms of victories is that the leadership of the movement, for the most part, unfortunately, what many have correctly called black misleaders, have been tied to the Democratic Party and the ruling class themselves, the same system that is responsible for all of these ills in society, whether you talk about economic exploitation or the issues of oppression. And so what we need is an understanding and an integrity in the leadership of social movements and of the labor movement to fight genuinely on all fronts. And also, bottom line, as you're correctly saying, the bottom line is, unless you, the working class, poses a threat to the profit machine of the ruling class of Wall Street, we are not going to win. That is why it's important. So one of the lessons that Google workers, for example, learned is that merely talking to the Google executives and bosses wasn't going to address the issue of sexual harassment in the workplace. they needed to do a rolling walkout. Remember, they did a rolling walkout. The workers, tech workers, did a rolling walkout in 2018, all the way from Seattle to Mumbai, my home city, in order to shut down the offices and win some. And they won some partial victories out of it. So that's an example of where working people understand that needs to be done. And so at this moment, it is very crucial, no matter what your specific issue is you're fighting on, we all as working people need to stand in active solidarity with the UPS Teamsters, because if they can go on strike and win something big, win a real contract, and we should talk about concretely what they're fighting for, this is going to be earth-shattering. If they can go on strike and win, this will be earth-shattering for the working class. It will really help to set the stage for a historic fighting, period of fighting movements. And why? Because of the strategic and unparalleled ability that UPS workers have to disrupt the entire economy. UPS workers move up to 6% of US GDP and 2% of global GDP. I mean, this is huge, and it is a genuinely important opportunity that should not be squandered because of the social power that the workers have, and also should not be forgotten the fact that a strike at UPS would have overwhelming support from the working class. I mean, every working person I've talked to says, "Oh my God, I really support these UPS workers. I hope they're able to go on strike. I hope they're able to win." And that's why Worker Strike Back is right now. Worker Strike Back activists are handing out leaflets that says Worker Strike Back supports UPS Teamsters, get on strike ready.
Yeah, and we've covered a couple of their practice pickets, and something that I've noticed compared to the other union efforts we've followed, including bad things like I went to Detroit when GM laid off over 50,000 workers a couple years ago. A lot of problems with the union efforts have been the bosses at the top of these unions selling out the workers. It seems so far that the Teamsters leadership, could change, is being fairly aggressive. Sean O'Brien, the president, has already told, publicly told President Biden, do not get involved. Obviously, Biden and the Democrats blocked the railroad workers. It seems that Teamsters is simpatico with the rank and file, which is very important because part of the decimation of labor and unions over the last 40 years has been weak and corrupt leadership at these unions. Can you talk about what you're seeing from so far, the organizing amongst UPS workers and the leadership that seems, do you think their strategy is working?
I think major shifts have happened in the Teamsters Union. As we know, the fact that the members overwhelmingly sent the previous and really corrupt regime, of HAFA, they sent them packing, and the Teamsters for a Democratic Union were able to win this election with Sean O'Brien becoming president. And all of that is really, these are really important developments because they show that the rank and file of the Teamsters are done with that kind of corrupt regime which sells out the workers, and they want genuine changes in their standards of living. And so it's undoubtedly true that there's a lot of pressure on the O'Brien leadership to deliver a really good contract. And in fact, it's good that Sean O'Brien has publicly talked about the main issue here, which is for the part-time workers, and ending the justly hated 22-4 regime, in that the two-tier system that the UPS corporation has put in place in order to, again, it's a strategy of dividing and conquering the workers. And at this point, as Sean O'Brien has said in many interviews, part-time workers are the UPS part-time workers are the unsung heroes here. In fact, as he has said, we have seen part-time workers in many big cities. Over 100,000 of them actually are living in poverty and making less than $28 an hour. These are abysmal statistics, and that is what we're talking about. We are talking about workers who are moving packages every single day, working 60, 80-hour weeks. They are, they don't have air conditioning in their vehicles even now. These are record hot summers. You've talked about that on your show. So all of this suffering, why? So that the multimillionaire and billionaire executives, the major shareholders, all the people who are benefiting from in the UPS regime, who are benefiting from the hard work of these workers. And that's why it's important that we be clear what the demands are of the workers. As I said, the top demand is ending the two-tier system, and the demand for $30 an hour for all part-timers as starting pay, a $10 an hour raise for all workers, or for all full-time workers, sorry, and also a demand for full-time jobs for all the part-timers who want it, not sort of exploiting them and only giving them part-time job even when they want full-time jobs, and also the demand that all vehicles need air conditioning now, and the political understanding that we cannot make concessions on any of these demands. It's important to remember, because yes, ending the two-tier system will be crucial, but it's also important to understand that what UPS gives with one hand, they will attempt to take back with another. And so we have to look at the contract and make sure and work. When I say we, I mean the UPS Teamster rank and file. I stand with them in looking at the contract very carefully and rejecting any kinds of poison pills. Why am I saying that? Because we know a counter proposal was from UPS, projected counter proposal was leaked, and in that they were proposing major cuts to part-time healthcare. They were not going to give any new full-time jobs, and there were plans for 6-day and 7-day mandatory work weeks. So all of this means that they will try to in name give, if they can get away with it, if we allow them to get away with it, they'll give in name, they'll end the two-tier system, but then basically try to take all the concrete gains away. So rather they're sort of bringing the part-time workers back to square one, and in fact making the full-time workers worse off. And so we have to absolutely stand against it. Can you imagine these workers might find themselves working Wednesday to Sunday without a break? This is absolutely unconscionable. And the leaked proposal cuts the top rates of the new full-time drivers from $42 to $32, and of new inside workers from $36 to $24. So in other words, they're saying we'll end this two-tier system, but we'll quietly put this other two-tier system in place, the new one to replace the old. This is absolutely unconscionable. And so I just want to be on record. As a socialist, I stand with all the Teamster rank and file who want to fight back and go on strike to make sure that we don't accept any of these poison pills and we won an actual victory.
And I also think it's important, when you have decades of abuse, sometimes the abuse finally, the reality catches up. And what I mean by that, can you imagine in the year 2023, a company that has a $13 billion profit last year, they just won a victory of air conditioning to Teamsters, just won air conditioning. The fact that they even have to fight for this when you have 4 days in a row of record global temperatures. So that kind of exploitation abuse, I think it resonates now with the broader population, because everybody is feeling this climate crisis. You have in the Northeast now, the wildfires are giving us smoke where you can't go outside. Globally, I mean, China just had record temperatures, Spain. So the fact that workers are working insane hours for not enough pay with no air conditioning, I think that really resonates with the broader public, even, some comfortable people that are more of the neoliberal persuasion.
You're absolutely right. There is so much solidarity among the working class, not only in America, but globally, both on the economic questions, increasingly so, much more so today than in our lifetimes before, but also on the issue of climate crisis, because, the problem is not that you need to convince ordinary people there's a climate crisis. The problem is that on the basis of capitalism, these things are not going to change because of the fact that the billionaires are making too much money from this current system, so they have no incentive to end fossil fuel use. But we do, because our planet is collapsing as we speak, and so we do need to fight back. And you're totally right that there is huge solidarity with the UPS Teamsters on the air conditioning issue. And it should be mentioned, UPS crowed a lot about, we have conceded on this air conditioning demand, but look at what they've actually offered. They've offered that the air conditioning would be done at the end of the next contract cycle. So it's not going to happen for several years from now. Until several years from now. And furthermore, what all they've promised is a third of their fleet will have air conditioning. I mean, because you got to think, right? As you said, $13 billion profits. How much does it cost to put air conditioning in their trucks, right? It's literally pocket change for them, and they still are going to nickel and dime workers. Why? It's important to understand why. It's not because it is, I mean, of course, they're loath to give even 1 penny to the working class, but they have more at stake, because if they give in on any of the demands, as small as it might be, like $15 an hour, for example, then they know that the working class will be energized, feel empowered, and it will build the building blocks for future struggles. That is why the capitalist class fights tooth and nail against any gain for the working class, even if working people might think, oh, it's such a small thing, why don't you just relent on this one? And in fact, if you look at the overall demand for, to end the exploitation of part-time workers and the two-tier system in UPS, statistics show that it would cost maybe 0.3% of their overall cost structure for UPS. So again, it is pocket change for them, but they are going to fight tooth and nail, and that is why we have to, there's no substitute for rank and file organizing, and then a fight to have a very powerfully prepared strike that can win. And so strike preparation is also a crucial piece of what we need to understand, that the work that we need to do in the labor movement. Serious strike preparation, understanding the role of strike action. Why is it crucial to take the strike action seriously? Because that is what hits the profit machine of the bosses. And we can't in talking about UPS, the UPS struggle, we can't forget what happened to the railroad workers. Biden and the Democrats they broke the railroad workers strike, and more than half of the railroad workers were represented by the Teamsters Union. So I want this message, for rank and file Teamsters, that let's remember how the railroad workers were betrayed. Let's not let that happen again. Let's fight back. Let's win a big victory in UPS, and that will set the stage for other workers as well. And hopefully also the railroad workers can come back with a renewed fight for their own rights. But there's no doubt in my mind, or in anybody's mind in the working class, really, if UPS workers can win big, that it will ignite the kind of struggle that we have not seen in more than a generation, which is exactly why the bosses are not going to want to let that happen.
And nationally, obviously, it seems very early in the process. The media and the Democratic Party are on a crusade to, I guess, try and get Cornel West to drop out before he's even officially the nominee. He, of course, has to win the nomination for the Green Party, which wouldn't happen until next year. But Cornel, has done interviews on CNN and elsewhere. And CNN, one of their anchors specifically said, down at the end in the final stretch, if you're at 3-4% in the critical swing states, will you drop out and support Joe Biden? Anderson Cooper had Cornel West on last night, and the interview was a bit crazy. But after he had James Carville on, who said Cornel West merely running is a menace to the constitutional order. What I find incredible is, at the end of the day, yes, I don't want Donald Trump to be president again. I'm sure you don't. But it seems that the Democratic Party is putting the onus on the voters to prevent that from happening, rather than them, the party, or Joe Biden convincing voters not to vote for Cornel West or another candidate and vote for them. They don't seem to think they have a role in terms of any executive actions Joe Biden could take from now till the general election, or any specific victories he could yield for the working class. Yeah,
I know. We already saw, right, in 2016, how well the Democratic Party and DNC's strategy of vote for Hillary Clinton, she's not Trump, worked. How well did that work for them, and for the nation? And in fact, it's really important for the left to energize behind the Cornel West campaign and really raise the question of the need for a new party, because the Democrats and the Biden campaign run is, it's totally failing working people, which is precisely what, for decades, the betrayals of Democrats, which is precisely what created the opening for the Trump-style right populism and why he won in the first place. It's because of the failures of the Democrats to stand up for even the minimal decent living standards of working people, this is why this has happened. And then when you run an epitome of the corporate establishment, then the writing, it was on the wall, in 2016, and who knows what will happen now. But the point is that they are willing to gamble with the lives of ordinary people, because it sort of reveals that they would much rather defeat any kind of working class agenda. Last time it was Bernie, in 2016 it was Bernie, now it's Cornel West, than actually do what it would take to defeat Donald Trump, which is, you said recently, even if the Democrats are not actually going to do the things that working people need them to do, like $15 an hour, Medicare for all the other things that working people need, can they at least pledge so that they can win, they can raise the profile of Biden? But I think you said this also, that the reason the Democrats don't make these promises is because it puts them on the hook. And they don't want to be on the hook because they have no intention. They have no intention of pushing for any of these things that working people need, because their loyalty to Wall Street is what trumps every other agenda that they might have. So they may have some progressive members in their party, but at the end of the day, they all bend the knee to the corporate establishment. And so you saw a very, very unfortunate, and I completely disagree with Bernie on this, within hours of Biden announcing his campaign, Bernie endorsed him, and without even any conditionality, it's just a fulsome endorsement. And then we saw AOC endorsing him. This is completely shameful, and this is precisely what shows that this is a dead end. We've tried the progressive caucus in the Democratic Party. We've tried the squad. All of these people, they stand in line. They stand in line under the discipline of the Democratic Party leadership, and they will betray working people. They have shown that again and again, and that is why it is so crucial that we really build a momentum around Cornel West's run, because this is what working people need. Working people need independent political representation that is accountable to us. And as I said, ultimately, it's not a question of just one Cornel West running. It's a question of fighting to build a new political organization for the working class.
On the Bernie and AOC point, something that I don't think really gets examined is if AOC, came to prominence on a Green New Deal, which kind of was a knockoff from the Green Party, but putting that aside, if she really means what she says, that we're in a climate emergency, and she said we needed upwards of $10 trillion, which I agree with. But when she was questioned by a podcast, she says, given the candidates or given the choices, I would go with Biden. Well, how can you mean it? How can you mean what you say? I mean, I don't think any objective people, whether you support Marianne Williamson or not, or RFK Jr. or not, or Cornel West or not, objective people just looking at the record, any of those would be better as far as the climate crisis than Joe Biden.
We can all agree that Joe Biden is not the candidate.
Right. But I questioned, how can you actually mean what you say on the Green New Deal and this and that? I mean, it seems that she's more concerned about losing her committee seats or her future political upward climb than a Green New Deal.
I think that's absolutely correct. I want to be clear. I mean, I don't support Marianne Williamson or RFK, but as I said, one thing we can agree on is Biden is not the candidate if we want to fight for working people, for climate change, for any of the things that our society needs desperately, because the Democratic Party is simply not the way to go. And for her to say that Biden is the candidate is also the most important reason, actually, why that is patently dishonest, is that you have Cornel West running. I mean, I could understand if she said that before Cornel West. I mean, I still wouldn't agree or condone it, but she's saying this after Cornel West has announced his candidacy. So none of these squad members have any courage to stand with the Cornel West campaign because they have to pledge their loyalty to the Democratic Party leadership. And at the end of the day, that is what this is about. In fact, in an increasingly rare moment of honesty, AOC recently said, that it is about relational harm. Like if we, the squad, did what the Freedom Caucus, the ultra MAGA Congress members did, then it would cause relational harm. And what she meant was it would cause them difficulties with the Democratic Party leadership. So at the end of the day, what this reveals is that these squad members, even if we assume that some part of them is genuine, at the end of the day, they prioritize their own daily existence of peace with the Democratic establishment because they don't want to do what it takes to go to war against the DNC. And what does it take? It takes you being a fighter every single day of your life and taking the heat of the Democratic Party leadership, which is what I do every single day. I'm not a Democrat. I'm an independent socialist. But what we have done in these nearly 10 years in city council is such a wonderful example. And I don't mean that in a personal sense. I mean in the sense of what example it shows that what we need is elected representatives who are willing to do what it takes. And in other words, we have to define it as not as personal characteristics, but as the bare minimum accountability questions. Like, if we elect you, are you willing to fight for us? And it's also deeper than what just that one elected representative will do. It's also a question of a party for working people. One of the reasons we have succeeded so tremendously in Seattle in winning just the victories that are unheard of, that we were told we would never win, is because I am not alone. I have Socialist Alternative as my organization, and Socialist Alternative members themselves. We are part of the working class nationally. We fight alongside other working people, and we know how to mobilize and organize, and we have a political analysis that all of our organizing work rests on. And that is what we need. And so although failures of the squad and the Congressional Progressive Caucus, unfortunately also of Bernie Sanders, although we strongly supported his campaigns both times, all of this shows that if we don't build from the ground that kind of deeper organizing where we activate ordinary people and create an organization that they have the ability to hold leadership accountable, because leadership betrayals will probably happen all the time. Unless we do all of that, we're not going to win. I mean, just to give you a concrete example, we were able to win the Amazon tax, the historic over $200 million tax on the richest people to fund affordable housing. We won that in the middle of the George Floyd rebellion. And the reason we were able to win was because we built this tax Amazon movement that was, in my experience, the most democratic movement that I've ever been part of, where we elected a coordinating committee. I was part of that coordinating committee. But this coordinating committee was held accountable by the rank and file of the movement. And the way we did that was by organizing mass tax Amazon action conferences where hundreds of people attended each one. And so together we had thousands of people attending these conferences where literally every rank and file member had a vote on all the key issues that the movement had in front of us. And that was how we held the leadership accountable, and that is how we forced the Democrats and the Chamber of Commerce to concede on the Amazon tax. So that's a model for what we need.
Right. And my last question on the national side, it seems to me, listen, I don't want to minimize the threat of Trump. Obviously, Republicans, particularly on the state level, also are doing all sorts of terrible autocratic things. I think fascistic things. You look at Ron DeSantis and book bans and anti-LGBT, trans, Texas. So it's not to minimize it. They are indeed a threat. But it seems to me that I don't know if Bernie-AOC, these people who we thought were progressive, it seems they're only concerned about one form of fascism, because I don't really hear any of them talking about Cop City, which I think is just straight up fascism going on. You have Georgia police with the help of the FBI and federal agencies. They assassinated an environmental protester. Crickets from progressives, crickets from the Georgia senators who are Democrats. They are arresting protesters, nonviolent protesters, and charging them with domestic terrorism, keeping them in jail for months for having flares on them, for running from police. We're talking domestic terrorism for nonviolent people. They are basically colluding the police with the local government, with real estate developers. I mean, this is a form of fascism. Fascism is not only of a white supremacy form. There are many levels of fascism, but I hear nothing or no concern from people we believe are progressive or have formally galvanized the progressive movement. There's plenty of other examples we could give of the Democratic Party and fascism. We saw the George Floyd protests, millions mobilizing around the country. Biden has given police more money. They have canceled their primary, basically just saying to hell with democracy. We will not hold a primary. And the media has gone along with that. So what do you say in terms of Bernie, the squad, other progressives? They seem to be very concerned about the Republicans with valid reason, but they seem to have blinders on for the things I'm talking about.
Yes, I think what we see and what we're talking about is this whole pattern of how they will selectively talk about Trump in order to bump up the support for, or try and bump up anyway, the support for Biden. Basically, it's the message of, well, Biden is, yes, you might be angry at Biden for this or that reason, but at least he's not Trump. That is the kind of message that they're trying to deliver. And, as you said, we have to be very clear, DeSantis presidency is also dangerous for working people. A Trump presidency undoubtedly is going to be dangerous. And in fact, we have to be clear, this second time around, if Trump wins, this second time around, he's going to come back much more empowered than before to carry out his dangerous right populist agenda. And so we can't have any illusions about what that represents, but that's precisely why we have to fight for a left alternative for Donald Trump, because it is the same, it's repeating, history repeating itself with the Democrat, the party that has betrayed working people, being the Democratic Party, namely, being the only alternative to the right populist candidate, and that the Democratic Party itself has given rise and created space for this type of dangerous right-wing candidacy. And also, not to mention all the MAGA and ultra-MAGA Congress members who have been elected and senators. I mean, this is all very dangerous development on the whole, but that is precisely why we have to fight for a left alternative. The Democrats like to pose it as opposed, that well, if you want a left alternative, then we're going to end up getting Trump elected. But that is a lie, and that is exactly it's like truth flipped on its head. If you are afraid of justly wary of what a second Trump presidency would represent, then that is precisely why we have to fight on the left. And so we have to have the courage to flip truth back to what it actually is and reject these false messages from the Democratic Party. And you're absolutely right. I mean, the very fact that anything can be passed as Cop City today in the wake of the George Floyd protests, it's just, it makes bile rise into my mouth. It is so nauseating for me that anything called Cop City could be approved. And so what we're seeing is a continuation of the betrayal by the Democratic Party regime in city after city. All of these cities, starting with the Minneapolis Mayor Jacob Frey and the Democrats there, and then the Democrats in Seattle, and the Democrats in New York, Democrats in Los Angeles, everywhere making promises, even shedding tears. There was Democrats here who shed tears in press conferences saying, I'm going to do better, Black Lives Matter. And then the next moment, the moment the movement subsides, they walked back all their promises, and now you have an aggressive sort of coming. Then you see them coming back aggressively in Cop City is one example, and we saw what happened when the mentally, the person with mental health that was killed brutally in the New York subway. We saw what Eric Adams has done. He was overseen as the mayor of New York. We see this in city after city. And as you said, the Georgia senators slapping just really unspeakable domestic terrorism charges on protesters. All of this is deeply disturbing, and I think we have to connect, what this reveals is sort of the bipartisan agenda. We have to connect this also to the bipartisan agenda on U.S. imperialism. So we see both domestically and internationally the kind of violence purveyors that the U.S. imperialist regime is, and that incorporates both the Democratic Party leaders and the Republican Party. Both of these are complicit. They both have blood on their hands, and that is why whether you when you're watching this, whether you are angry at the Democrats because of their warmongering at Biden for his warmongering, or you're angry at the Democrats for economic issues, both of those lead to the same conclusion, which is that we need to fight back and build independent struggles of working people. And in fact, concrete struggles matter. We have to develop an analysis, because without an analysis, we don't have a backbone to hold up struggles and win success. But that has to be followed up by action. And concretely, right now, there are two very important things happening. We already talked about the UPA struggle, which is crucial. So if people are watching this, and if you have worker strike back branches in your cities, make sure you contact them, because we're standing in solidarity with UPS workers. We're going to be organizing alongside them. And then the other very important thing that's happening is what I mentioned earlier, which is the union organizing drive at the Cincinnati, Northern Kentucky Airport, which in other words, the KCVG Amazon Air Hub, where the lead workers, the organizing committee, the workers who are organizing this union drive, they are showing tremendous courage and political clarity. They are organizing, activating their fellow workers, which is exactly the thing to do, which is what GFK workers did in New York in the first place in Staten Island, without which they would not have won their union election. But as the KCVG organizing committee is correctly saying, this is about winning the union against Amazon's relentless union busting. But then on top of that, we need to win a strong contract, which means it puts the question of a powerfully prepared strike action also front and center.
And lastly, how do people get involved with Workers Strike Back?
You can go to Workers Strike Back, all one word, workersstrikeback.org, or you can contact me personally. Just Google my name. You'll find how to get in touch with Workers Strike Back or me, or you can write to socialistalternative.org.
Great. Thank you for taking time. We'll do this again soon before you leave your position with Seattle City Council. And if you're in Seattle, definitely get involved as council member fights with Socialist Alternative on the rent control issue. Thanks for taking the time.
Thanks so much, Jordan. I just wanted to mention, if you're watching this and you're in Seattle, make sure to join us at Seattle City Hall in Chambers on Friday, July 21st at 9:30 a.m., where the committee will be voting on rent control legislation from my office. And then after that, it will go for the full council vote on August 1st.
Thank you.